Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Novara Live. I'm your host, Dalia Gebrial, and today I am thrilled to be joined by Micha Frazer-Carroll for her debut at Novara Live. Micha, for our audience who might not know you, tell us a little bit about yourself. What do you do? What's your star sign? What's your hobbies?
Hi, Dalia. It's great to be on. Yeah, my name is Micha. My star sign is I'm a Libra, I believe. I'm not a horoscope buff, but I do know that. And I'm a freelance journalist. I've edited for various publications like The Guardian and Gaudem, and I'm also involved in a lot of anti-racist and abolitionist groups. Last year, I published a book called Mad World, which is on the politics of mental health. So yeah, my interests are really mental health and anti-racism.
Very key sort of intersection there. And also, Libra women are very elite. I love Libra women. My mother's a Libra woman, so we're already going to have a good time here. So, coming up later tonight, 22 activists have been arrested for attempting to protest outside the Drax power plant. Ash Sarkar calls out right-wing commentator Matthew Goodwin. And of course, we're going to talk about the massive counter-demonstrations before that eclipsed last night's far-right actions. Anti-racists vastly outnumbered the far right across the country last night in a show of defiance against racism. In Walthamstow, thousands swelled the streets and the atmosphere was joyous as the far right was seemingly a no-show. However, in Finchley, small numbers of far-right activists were reportedly spotted, and 4 guys in Brighton picked the wrong town for a far-right demonstration and had to be protected by the police from thousands of anti-fascists. In Nottingham, footage shows 2 so-called patriots surrounded by anti-racists. In Blackpool, 7 guys holding an England flag occupied a roundabout. A few far-right protesters faced off with anti-racists in Aldershot, including Nick Tenconi, leader of UKIP and far-right group Turning Point UK, who was chanting "Communist scum off our streets." The picture wasn't quite as clear-cut in Chatham, where anti-racists were reportedly outnumbered by the far right. Luckily, that's the only part of the country where we have reports that the far right were not outnumbered quite significantly. As Novara Media reported last night, it was unclear just how many far-right demonstrations had really been organised, with many anti-fascist researchers warning people not to spread false panic. However, it's certain that a strong anti-racist message has been sent in the wake of far-right riots. Micha, how do you feel? How do you respond to these scenes of the far-right being mostly outnumbered, not just in London, but across the country?
So I think these scenes are really amazing to see. The community response to these riots has just been so huge. And I think seeing so many different community groups come together and mobilize really, really quickly. For example, the Autonomous Anti-Fascist Committee did loads and loads of work and organizing. I think it's made me feel really reassured, because I do think there was kind of this moment when we were seeing kind of all the scenes of rioting where it felt like the situation felt quite helpless, or it felt like, how do we actually know on the left whether we have the infrastructure, the kind of thinking ahead and strategizing to combat this so quickly? So yeah, I think that makes me feel really good and really kind of hopeful about also the future of anti-racist and anti-fascist organizing on the left. I do think also the way that, social media users came together on Instagram and stuff like this, sharing call outs saying, we need more people in Finchley, for example. That was really like kind of quick thinking, and shows that even if we don't necessarily have loads of tools, loads of resource, we can use what we have. I do think that we shouldn't be too complacent. I think a kind of difficult element of, this story as it emerged was this kind of question lots of people had, which was, do we actually know if these riots, which, we thought were going to happen yesterday night, do we know how many of these are actually going to take place? There was obviously this kind of Telegram screenshot going around with this huge list of places, and lots of people were asking, do we have a reliable source for this? Do we know if they actually have the numbers to be able to mobilize like this across the entire country? And I think when a lot of that kind of didn't come together, or we saw they were outnumbered and kind of scared to come out, I've heard a bit of conversation around, maybe we actually didn't need to do as much as we did, or maybe people were being hyper vigilant or scaremongering. I think there's like a really nuanced conversation to be had around that. But I also basically think we shouldn't just kind of sit back and say, okay, actually, the far right are defeated, or maybe it wasn't that much of a threat. I think what we can kind of learn from what's happened is that we do really need to keep forward thinking, thinking ahead and strategizing to make sure that we don't find ourselves on the back foot. And so I think that involves kind of a lot of kind of maintaining these networks that have been established, and investing in anti-racist organizing in a sustainable way with a view to longevity.
The point you make about not getting complacent is so important, because the conditions that have produced the scenes that we have seen this week have certainly not gone away. I think many of us were anticipating and very anxious that it was going to be a lot worse than it ended up being last night. Going to those protests, it was very scary. I was scared about what we were going to confront, because we really didn't know how serious the organizing of the far right was. But it is still the case that not only are the conditions that produce these kind of mobilizations still very much alive, but unfortunately, I think that the sentiment behind a lot of these so-called anti-immigration protests seem to be shared by more people than we might have thought. A YouGov poll found that a third of British people support these so-called anti-immigration protests, even as they spiraled into violent riots. That's a very concerning statistic, because it shows that, yes, whilst we were able to mobilize and meet the moment when it needed to be met, it's extremely important that fascists and the far right do not feel comfortable organizing on our streets. But we also need to have a conversation about the more deep community organizing that needs to happen to really counteract the overwhelming narrative that people in this country receive from their media, from their politicians, that immigrants are the cause of all of your problems. As long as that structure remains intact, the threats that luckily we fought back last night are still going to be very present in our community. So completely agree with you there, Micha. So, Met Police Commissioner Sir Mark Rowley was keen to take the credit and put the police on the same side as local communities.
It was a massive policing operation. I'm really pleased with how it went. And we put thousands of officers on the street. And I think the show of force from the police, and frankly, the show of unity from communities together defeated the challenges that we've seen. And it went off very peacefully last night. A couple of locations, we had some local criminals turn out and try and create a bit of antisocial behaviour, and we arrested a few of them. But it was a very successful night, and the fears of sort of extreme right disorder were abated. So a successful operation thanks to communities and police.
Also in the mix is Conservative Party leadership candidate Robert Jenrick. He was accused of Islamophobia yesterday for saying that a person shouting Allahu Akbar in the street should, in some cases, be arrested. An ally of Jenrick told Politico this today. Politics is not about avoiding rows. It's about having good fights. He spoke some hard truths and then the riots stopped. Wow. Well, the implication there being that these rioters were ready to go, and then, they saw Robert Jenrick on telly saying some strong words and thought, you know what, lads, our work here is done. We've got nothing more to add to what Robert Jenrick has to say, as if anyone in this country besides the very small group of people that are really into politics know who Robert Jenrick is, let alone care what he has to say. The Crown Prosecution Service said 149 people have now been charged. Some of them have had their sentences fast-tracked. And there was even sentencing live-streamed this morning from Liverpool Crown Court. The judge set out some general principles, saying that the sentences are meant to be a deterrent to others. Sentences handed down included 43-year-old John O'Malley, who was jailed for 2 years and 8 months after admitting violent disorder in Southport. Here's what the judge had to say.
You have a previous conviction for an offence of violence. More significantly, you were part of a crowd using obviously racist and religiously intolerant language that was demonstrating quite deliberately outside a mosque. And you were an active and persistent participant And this combination of factors takes a sentence, in my judgment, to the top of the relevant bracket.
Also in the dock was 69-year-old William Nelson Morgan, jailed for 2 years and 8 months for violent disorder and possession of an offensive weapon. He had a kosh, I had to look that up, that's a heavy stick or club which is wielded as a weapon, which he claimed he bought for his own protection. The Independent reported on the arrest as followed. Body-worn footage showed the widower telling officers to get off him as they attempted to arrest him. At one point, he said, "I'm fucking 70. And an officer responded, "Well, why are you at a fucking riot?" I think that goes for people of any age. Why are you here at this race riot? The government is promising swift justice, which raises questions about why these cases can be so quick while others take years. Policing Minister Diane Johnson talked about this on Times Radio this morning.
Seeing people in court, people being arrested, first of all, then charged, and then in court, and seeing the sentences handed out yesterday. There was one in Liverpool for 3 years for punching a police officer. I think that is all helping to make it clear that this level of criminality and thuggery and hooliganism on our streets will not be tolerated.
I think that's such an excellent point about how fast justice prevents further criminality. As you say, arrest, prosecution, conviction. But does that not highlight a broader problem here? That outside of this crisis, we have slow justice, cases taking years. And this is not a contentious demographic point I'm making. We have a two-tier justice system in that sense. When there's a riot going on, you can manage to get someone through the system. They're pleading guilty, which obviously speeds it up. But they're still being processed very quickly. But everywhere else, we have the normal system, which is very, very slow. And in some ways, what you just talked about there as a credit, which it is an indictment of the system generally.
Yes, and obviously the Labour government came in, I think it was 4 weeks ago now, and we are very clear that the criminal justice system needs to be swifter in its dealings with perpetrators. You know, we are very focused on making sure that the long waits that are completely unacceptable, particularly around rape trials that, you know, I know about, are waiting years.
So what are you doing about it? What's the plan?
So that whole way of working, I know the Ministry of Justice, I know the Lord Chancellor, particularly focused on making sure that we get swift justice and that perpetrators are held to account.
It's incredible, isn't it? It's like there's the media and politicians just operate at this one register. Like there's so many different things that you could be talking about right now. You can talk about why is it that such a organized group in our society are willing to go out and smash their communities up and taunt people of color, try and burn asylum seekers alive. And why is it that an even bigger section of society are seemingly backing, you know, these so-called anti-immigration protests? And yet the only register you can operate in is, how do we make this so that there's more police? How do we make this so that it's easier to put people in jail? How do we make sure that we can just make our society even more carceral, rather than thinking about why are we even in here in the first place, and what accountability do media and politicians have for getting us here? Is there a connection between the fact that this is where people in this country have arrived to, this kind of idea that asylum seekers and immigrants are the enemy? Is that connected to the fact that maybe for the past several decades, our media and our politicians have routinely talked about people of color and migrants and refugees and asylum seekers as the enemy? Like, the lack of accountability stuns me. But also, and you know, the presenter here tries to distance himself. You know, he talks about this idea of two-tier policing, and he tries to distance himself from the discourse that has otherwise been flourishing amongst right-wing and far-right circles around this idea of two-tier policing, two-tier care, which refers to this idea that white anti-immigration, quote unquote, i.e. far-right protesters, are subject to much harsher policing than everyone else. Black and brown people, to be specific. This is an ongoing trope that we have. This idea of the state's gone soft, the police are scared of being called racist, and so, you know, they're soft on people of color, they're soft on ethnic minorities, and they're harsh. It's the same logic as, you know, you're arrested for even speaking English these days. You know, that kind of logic that there's somehow, you know, people of color are getting a free pass in this country and white people, especially white right-wing people, are being subject to harsh policing. That's what this two-tier policing thing invokes. First of all, the reason that this policing, these fast tracking of trials, etc., is happening is because this is how the state responds to a riot, right? In 2011, when there were the riots there in London, the same thing happened. People were very swiftly put in jail. They had very, very long sentences. You had people going down for years for stealing, a bottle of water. So really much harsher, actually, than we're seeing right now, which we can put down to the fact that not all the rioters in the London riots were white and right-wing. But also this idea that people of color somehow get away with anything in this country is so absurd when you consider the fact that people of color in this country are disproportionately surveilled and policed. They are more heavily policed than any other demographic. When you look at the statistics, when you look at stop and search rates, for example, the stop and search rates of Black people is around 10%. So 10% of Black people in this country, roughly, have experienced stop and search in their life. Of Asian people, that's 2%. Of white people, it's 0.5%. When you look at the prison population, over 25% of people in prison are from ethnic minority backgrounds, whereas ethnic minorities make up 18% of the population. Now, right-wing people will look at that and say, oh, well, the reason that you're more heavily policed or that people of color are more likely to be arrested or receive harsh sentences or end up in prison is because there's something inherently criminal about people of color. Whereas when they are subject to harsh policing, which they have been, this is pretty harsh, the kind of swiftness and, spectacle of putting people into prison. But when they experience it, it's two-tier policing. It's the police that are unfair. But when the police subject Black and brown people to it, which they do on a daily basis, it's because they deserve it. And if anything, they're not going far enough. So really, the fact that this is the conversation we are having right now just shows that our media do not have the capacity to meet the moment that we are at with the critical faculties and the historical context that it requires. It's so frustrating. Of all the discussions we could be having right now, the discussion we're having is why don't we have more police in society? Anyway, looking ahead, 20 potential gatherings and 3 counter-protests are planned for tonight. That's according to the National Police Chiefs Council, but of course, take that with a pinch of salt, as they also massively overstated the scale of potential disorder for Wednesday. 8 far-right protests are planned, however, for this weekend that we know about. And Friday will see demonstrations in Crawley in Sussex, in Ballymena in Northern Ireland. On Saturday, there will be demonstrations in Liverpool, Glasgow, Hull, Newcastle, Shrewsbury, and Salford. And many of these will again be opposed by anti-racists. Meanwhile, in London, Keir Starmer held another Cobra meeting this afternoon in anticipation of any more disorder, but he's also said this.
The most important lesson is for those involving themselves in disorder, because what we've seen is that those that are being arrested now, numbered in their hundreds, many have been charged, some already in court, and now a number of individuals sentenced to terms of imprisonment. That is a very important message to those involved in disorder. And I say it again, anybody involving themselves in disorder, whatever they claim as their motive, will feel the full force of the law. It's important I repeat that, because we need to make sure that in the coming days we can give the necessary reassurance to our communities, many of whom, I've been talking to some this morning, are very anxious about the situation.
But what is Starmer doing in relation to some of the people who have faced abuse over the past several days? Novara Media's Moya Lothian-McLean spoke on that issue with Mu'min Khan, CEO of the Abdullah Killian Mosque in Liverpool.
Sir Keir Starmer as the Prime Minister now and the Labour Party as a whole do need to step up their marks and be able to make it an inclusive, that if the government starts to separate and encourages Islamophobia, then none of us are safe, whether you're Muslim or not a Muslim. And that needs to be taken deeper into the government's heart to say that, listen, we would need to do that.
Have you had any direct contact, or any Muslim leaders had direct contact with 10 Downing Street in the wake of the far-right attacks?
Not that I'm aware of, but I'm sure Muslims in some of the Muslim leaders in the Northwest and also in the London area would have met with him or have made some contacts with the Prime Minister, and I think they're having an ongoing dialogue.
Micha, what do you make of this seeming reluctance to name Islamophobia as Islamophobia?
Yeah, I think it's like a very curious decision from Keir Starmer, which clearly is trying to kind of tread a line and sort of appease multiple camps. There's some feeling that maybe violence, violent disorder, phrases like this are acceptable to use, but to name Muslims as the primary targets of a lot of this far-right violence for some reason feels like something that Keir Starmer can't do. And it seems as if that's about appeasing people on the far right, most likely, or not further kind of inflaming or kind of outright naming it as anti-Muslim racism.
Yeah, and I think it's also a way for, because if you name Islamophobia as a chronic problem in Britain today, then you end up having to answer for your own contributions to Islamophobia and the kind of pedestrian Islamophobia that is part of British society now. Like, there's something about naming the specificity of actually who is on the receiving end, anti-migrant racism and Islamophobia. That's kind of what we can say is, and, all of this falls under racism more broadly, even if you're not, a first generation migrant or recently arrived migrant, or you're not Muslim or visibly Muslim, or perceived to be Muslim, you're still wrapped up and subject to this kind of this racist hysteria. But I think that reluctance to name it is to make sure that your own contributions to the environment that we're in don't then come under scrutiny. So you just kind of pretend that Islamophobia and anti-migrant racism are just not actually problems that need to be named. Journalists and politicians are roundly congratulating anti-racist protesters for stopping the far right from rioting across the country last night. But that was not the tone that many in the media took just a few hours before. Here's a clip from GMB the morning before riots were expected to begin.
Thankfully, people have mobilised, anti-racist groups have mobilised people to those areas. But there's some areas in
but then that's a worry.
Well, and the Home Secretary is saying, don't do that.
That then leads to confrontation in a different way, doesn't it?
To say that citizens themselves
vigilantes
should take over is also a problem.
Vigilantes?
Of course not. Of course not.
I think it was the fact that you said, thankfully, anti-racist groups, and we want to be careful that we're not supporting the idea that individuals stand up to rioters.
Well, individuals have stood up to fascism from, it's a very long-standing British tradition.
That was writer, broadcaster and friend of Novara Media, Nels Abbey, causing a stir by saying that it's good that anti-racists are planning to mobilise to stop the far right advancing on the streets. Now, look, I'm not going to pretend that last night wasn't tense, and maybe this is easy to say with hindsight because we were successful in pushing the far right back, and many who attended were obviously scared of what might happen. But anyone with a cursory knowledge of recent history knows that mass street mobilizations have always been an essential part of pushing the far right back. Like, we memorialize things like the Battle of Cable Street as this shining example of Britain's fight against fascism. But what was the Battle of Cable Street? It was exactly what we saw last night. It was the community responding to the threat of the far right by coming together and saying, you will not pass. You do not belong on our streets. Because frankly, just arresting people and setting the police on them is not actually what stops the rise of fascism. We know that especially the most committed of the hard right are more than willing to violently fight the police. What stops them is the fear of the masses and the knowledge that they have no legitimacy, including in the communities they claim to speak for. Some Labour MPs, however, defied the leadership's orders to not attend solidarity demos. Here's Clive Lewis on Sky News.
What was it like when you were at that protest this evening?
Peaceful. It was a fantastic atmosphere. It was one of the everyday people of Norwich coming together, standing together, because millions of people across this country, they've been absolutely appalled at what has materialised and transpired on their television screens and social media over the last week. The racist and fascist thugs that have been rampaging across this city, across this country, they're a minority. But last week, they looked like they were the majority. But I think from the pictures you're showing, from what we saw in Norwich, what we've seen in Northampton, from what we've seen in Walthamstow and Finchley, in towns and cities and communities across the country, we are the many, they are the few. And I think that was made really clear here in Norwich tonight.
That was Clive Lewis responding partly to, obviously, Yvette Cooper and other people in the Labour Party leadership who urged people not to go to the anti-racist solidarity demos last night. Micha, how do you think these people look in retrospect, both in the GMB segment that we showed earlier on in the show and also the Labour leadership ordering their MPs not to go to the solidarity demos last night?
Well, particularly with regards to the Labour leadership, this is something that we've heard with various demos in the past as well, for example, around Palestine. And I think it is really damning and it looks really, really bad, especially with hindsight. The fact that we saw these counter demonstrations were not kind of small or niche community gatherings. These were really, really, had really, really big turnouts and saw a lot of support. Not just from necessarily, really radical grassroots groups, but also people who might consider themselves progressive or kind of, centre left. And so I think that it looks really bad, to be honest, the instruction for Labour MPs not to go. And I think it's something that probably the party need to reflect on and think about in terms of how does it look to abstain from something that largely was such a kind of, from what I could see from footage of counter demonstrations, very celebratory, very warm and peaceful community gatherings that celebrated and kind of said, fascists aren't welcome here. And I think the decision for Labour to kind of direct people not to be involved in that or not to be associated with that seems really questionable in hindsight.
Retrospective support for last night's demos also came from some unlikely sources. The Daily Mail described it as the night anti-hate marchers faced down the thugs. And the Daily Express pictured a mass of anti-fascist protesters with the caption, "United Britain stands firm against thugs." Goes without saying, of course, that both the Daily Mail and the Daily Express have been some of the main vectors of anti-migrant sentiment in this country. In case you needed reminding, here are some past Daily Mail front pages. So we've got here 100,000 illegals stopped at the UK border. We've got the swarm on our streets and the true toll of mass migration on UK life. Oof. And here are some pages from the Daily Express. Migrant invasion out of control. Fears of surge in small boats. So, not that long ago, we were illegals and swarms and a toll on UK life. But today, we're anti-hate marchers facing down the thugs. How interesting, how convenient. Micha, obviously these headlines are, good headlines to see, I guess. But, have the Mail and Express just had a change of heart? Do they like us now?
If only. Yeah, I think that these headlines are really, really interesting and can feel like one of those moments of just gaslighting where you think, am I in a completely different reality? Have I imagined what I've seen of the right-wing press throughout my lifetime? But I think they are very telling of what's happening with the mood on the right with regards to these riots. I think that, you've seen, for example, figures like Nigel Farage condemning the riots as well. And I think it's very noticeable that they don't want to be seen to be linked to them or to have incited them. And that's what I think is going on with the Daily Mail. I don't know necessarily what their specific fear might be in terms of repercussions, but I think there is fear of culpability and being seen to have incited a riot. And I think, the media and political rhetoric on immigration over the last decade, it feels really clear to see that has undoubtedly played a really, really large role in whipping up this climate that led to these riots being possible. And I think that that's something that we should really hold on to. And again, not try to kind of think in the short term about that, because I think it's very easy to, for example, blame people like Elon Musk, who has obviously also come under fire for example, the spread of misinformation on X, formerly known as Twitter. And I think it is very easy to kind of pin the blame on someone who is not so embedded within specifically the British political climate and rhetoric around immigration. And so, yeah, I feel like while we must kind of look to figures like Musk, we also need to think about the right-wing press as a really significant institution in influencing the rhetoric around race and migration. And I think, obviously there were lots and lots of videos going around on social media of people who were either at riots or kind of seeing them dissipate. And I saw one where someone was having an altercation with someone who had come from one of these gatherings. And, this person came to the camera and they said, we just have to read the news. Like, if you don't know what's going on with immigration, read the news. And I think that was really, really telling, as where a lot of this rhetoric, doesn't necessarily originally come from. It doesn't emerge in a vacuum, but it definitely plays a role in whipping it up. And I think that narrative that migrants are kind of taking resource away from, hardworking people who should otherwise have access to this resource, the idea that it's outsiders who are taking that away, has obviously been parroted from the right-wing press over recent years. So, yeah, it feels very difficult to see them kind of trying to dodge the blame in this moment.
It kind of makes you wonder, like, if the Daily Mail or the Daily Express were not allowed to use the words migrant, refugee, asylum seeker, like, what would they write about? Like, what would actually fill their pages? It's very interesting to kind of think, a little thought experiment to think about that. 22 people have been arrested for attempting to protest outside a biomass power plant. The Drax power plant is located in Drax, Yorkshire, and provides electricity to the equivalent of 4 million homes. The power plant's owner, Drax Group, claims that it is, quote, the UK's largest renewable power station. The power station was previously coal-powered, but was converted to run on biomass in 2021. However, biomass is partly made up of trees and has been shown to include old forests, which doesn't sound all that green. The company has also been accused of, quote, environmental racism in the US Deep South, where it processes wood pellets. The pellets pollute the local environment, giving residents lung problems. And it is, campaigners say, no coincidence that the affected communities are poor and black. The superintendent for North Yorkshire Police said this: "Policing is not anti-protest. We are anti-crime and we are here to protect the public. The right to peaceful protest is part of UK democracy, but we also have a duty to ensure that people who work at Drax and members of the local community can go about their daily business as usual." The groups aiming to hold the protest camp are called Reclaim the Power and Axe Drax. Reclaim the Power is a direct action network fighting for social, environmental, and economic justice. Since 2013, it has held action camps in solidarity with frontline communities affected by fracking and fossil fuel extraction. One of the members of that group, Mary, had this to say to Novara Media about why they planned the action on the Drax plant.
The way that they produce wood pellets and burn them here in the UK causes devastating amounts of harm to communities abroad, particularly Black and brown communities, low-income communities. But despite this, our government claims that it's green, that it's good for the planet. They give them huge amounts of subsidies that we all pay for. And this is something that kind of flies under the radar. And so what we wanted to do with this camp was hold a space where we could bring light to that, bring light to the injustices that are being caused by Drax, the fact that we, as the public of Britain, are all being paid or all paying for it. And so it was going to be a camp filled with workshops, learnings, linking up with communities abroad to have that active solidarity and shining a light on all of Drax's dirty secrets. Over 20 people were arrested under suspicion of being involved with this camp. This was a huge effort by the police. They've poured huge amounts of resources into this, and it's yet again symptomatic of this incredibly close relationship between Drax and the state, where they can pull the resources into policing and trying to prevent peaceful protest just because they don't want to hear about what's going on. It's obviously incredibly devastating, the fact that this has happened. People are coming from all around the country to learn and to be together, and the police are doing everything within their power to stop that, to stop peaceful protest, which is particularly outrageous given everything that's happening in the UK right now. We've got race riots on our streets. We don't see the police preemptively arresting people participating in those, but this is a peaceful protest bringing light to environmental racism and the harm that our government is currently funding through its subsidies of Drax. The police saying that they're not anti-protest, they're anti-crime, is just fundamentally inaccurate. No one in Reclaim the Power was committing a crime. What they were doing is intending to hold a peaceful camp. Holding a camp is not a crime. Holding workshops, family spaces is not a crime. It's part of a protest. And what they've done is done everything within their power to prevent that from happening. And I think it's very clear to us that both the police and Drax didn't want any form of protest happening. They didn't want this in the media. They didn't want people talking about this or taking action against them. We weren't doing anything wrong. We were holding a camp, and that is fundamentally not an illegal thing to do. So they weren't preventing crime, they were just preventing protest. Currently, Drax is lobbying the government for billions more in subsidies. We've already handed them £7 billion to date from our energy bills. This is money meant for genuine renewables. Now is the time for people all around the country to be taking action to stop this scam. And so we're not going to stop. We're just going to keep going until we win.
Novara Media's very own Ash Sarkar recently went head-to-head with Matt Goodwin on Moral Maze on the topic of race riots in Britain.
Hey, Matt. Quick question. Do you think I'm English?
Yes, I don't see the relevance of that question. I think, as Tim said in his opening remarks, there's a tendency to reduce this debate to questions that might have been relevant many years ago, but are less relevant today. The vast majority of people in this country do not view their Englishness or Britishness through a racial lens.
I'm glad you said that, because I'd like to quote from one of your recent blog posts written after the dreadful stabbings in Southport. You wrote this: "These poor children thought they were going to a Taylor Swift-themed dance class. They ended up being murdered. And who murdered them? The son of immigrants from Rwanda." And I suppose my question for you is, why does it matter that the suspect is the son of immigrants if he was born in Cardiff, right? I was born in England. You consider me English. Do you not consider him Welsh?
Well, that was on my Substack. And the reason that I wrote that was because I was trying to make the point that we have a massive problem in this country with integration. We have a massive problem with absorbing millions of people who have come into Britain, principally over the last quarter century. And we can see that. It's instantly obvious to anybody who lives outside of the M25, lots of people in London too, that what we have essentially done is pursued a model that has prioritised group difference, and particularly on the left of politics, I would argue, has allowed minorities to celebrate their distinctive identity, culture, history, but has not allowed the majority to do the same. In the context of everything that has happened in this country in recent years, from British Muslims blowing up children at pop concerts, or people from minority backgrounds, recent illegal migrants, asylum seekers committing sexual assaults and rapes and so forth, to what we've seen in 7/7, et cetera, over the last 20 years, it's very obvious, I think, to lots of people in this country that the model of multiculturalism, which I think we first had an interesting debate about it in 2001, around community cohesion and Ted Cantle. We then had a debate about it with Trevor Phillips, so we sleepwalking to segregation. We then had another debate about it in 2011 with the England riots. We haven't answered this question. How are we going to build an integrated society? Imposing mass immigration on this country while thinking that we can integrate this country at the same time is not a serious answer to that problem.
So the crucial question that Ash asks there is, why is the fact that the Stockport suspect has Rwandan heritage more relevant than the fact that he was born and raised in Wales? Why, in committing this atrocity, does he become Rwandan rather than Welsh? So I'm going to talk here now as someone who is a child of immigrants, and visibly so. I've always known that there is a precarity underpinning my position in this country. I've always known that if I did something commendable, it's ascribed to my Britishness. But when I or anyone who looks like me does something condemnable, it's not only ascribed to our foreignness, but it's something that we are collectively punished for. I know that the decision to belong here is not entirely mine. And I know that for an increasingly vocal and powerful part of the society that I live in, whatever I do and however I behave, my very presence here is perceived as a problem that requires, to use Matt Goodwin's words, a serious answer. But I really want to talk here, actually, about this idea of integration. Because whenever you try to really drill down what it is about immigration that someone doesn't like, people like Matthew Goodwin love to dodge this questioning by saying that it's just a problem of integration, because it allows a plausible deniability that the problem isn't with someone's, say, skin color, which they cannot change, it's with their culture. Because culture, after all, can change. You know, people can change the way that they interact with the culture. So it seems a bit more of a sort of neutral and cerebral and high-minded thing to have a problem with. But Goodwin isn't talking about culture, because if you listen carefully, he slips between talking about cultural differences that immigrants may have and atrocities like sexual violence against women or stabbing children, as what happened in Southport. So the suspect in Southport is a British child of Rwandan parents. So the suggestion here, it seems, is that stabbing children at a dance party is somehow a cultural norm in Rwanda. I mean, of course it isn't. And we still don't know what caused the Southport suspect to do what he did. But unfortunately, violence occurs in every society and amongst every group of people. But what racism does is it essentializes characteristics across an entire population. So people who are subjected to racism cannot exist as individuals because we constantly find ourselves accountable for the actions of others in ways that white people just aren't. And that's why when a racialized person commits an act of violence, it becomes a conversation about the very right of racialized people to exist in peace. That doesn't happen when a white person commits an act of violence, like, I don't know, dropping a nuclear bomb or illegally invading a country. And every person of color in this country knows that. So we see how calling this a cultural integration issue is in fact a proxy for saying that person feels and looks different to me and I just don't like it. Here is some more from that debate.
I do read your Substack, Matt, and you have a blog post called Britain's Looming Demographic Crisis. And just to quote from that, you say that the share of the country's population that identifies as white British is forecast to become a minority group around the year 2070. Those who oppose these great inflows and do not embrace the rapid ethnic change they cause wonder why it is that politicians seem unable to stop them. Now, we can all agree the reason why there is a declining percentage of white British is because of the growth of Asian British, Black British, mixed race British people. So if you could explain it to me like I'm 5 years old, why should white British people feel scared that there are growing numbers of fellow Brits with darker skin? Because you're not talking about culture, you're not talking about religion there. You are just talking about race.
Well, lots of people put a value on the identity of the majority group, including members of minority communities. Profound demographic shifts of the scale that we're going through in this country at the moment have never been seen before in our history. This is unprecedented. We are going to see over the next 12 years alone another 6.5 million people come into the country, 6.1 million because of migration. Migration is going to be responsible for 90% of all of our population growth over the next decade. For many people in the country, it's not to do with race, it's to do with what that means for their culture, what it means for their shared values, what it means for the symbols of their national identity. So I think we need to have a very open, honest, challenging, hard-hitting conversation about what it means to be British and how we're going to promote integration. And I think these riots and disturbances are going to trigger that debate. I think it's inevitable. We cannot go back to what we had before this week.
Ash there asking the $1 million question, which is, why is the changing skin colour of British people so scary? Again, Goodwin falls back on this idea of cultural difference. First of all, culture is not a fossil. It's not fixed in time. It changes throughout history. Yes, partly because of migration, which has happened throughout human history, but also just because of the passage of time. Like, we don't all live the exact same way that we did 1,000 years ago. We aren't still like sacrificing animals and humans in Norse rituals or burning witches at the stake. Even if you chased every single person of colour out of the country, leaving just white people in England, culture wouldn't become a static thing. It would still be something that changed, that was struggled against and within and would shift. That's just the way that human society is. So Goodwin never actually gives a direct answer to the question of why is the increasing presence of darker-skinned British people so scary to you? Instead, he falls back on those muddled explanations that just don't make sense unless you think that Black and brown people have inherently worse cultures and characters. And when that fails, you just top it off with the classic, well, we just need to have a conversation about immigration, as if we aren't forced to talk about immigration literally every single day by the right-wing press on the terms of the right-wing press. Let's listen to one last contribution from Ash following the debate.
I think when it comes to connecting the race riots that we've been witnessing and the tenor of the conversation around immigration, for me, that's undeniable. Of course, me and Matt Goodwin would differ an awful lot on whether immigration is a good thing and how it ought to be handled. But I think I would just like to draw your attention to an element of our back and forth, because what happened in Southport specifically is being assigned by Goodwin as a problem of integration. Why is he assigning it as a problem of integration? We don't know what this attacker's motivations were. That information has not been made available to us. We don't know if it was mental health issues. We don't know if it was ideological. We simply don't know. The reason why it's being assigned that meaning is because this suspect is the child of Rwandan immigrants. So if you say that when a child of immigrants, and in particular a Black or an Asian child of immigrants, when they commit a crime, it's because of a problem of integration, and you can always say that simply because of where they come from, would we not call that racist? Because I think that would meet anyone's definition of it.
Micha, you'd have thought that, because the first exchange between, when Ash says, do you think I'm British? And he's like, yes, of course. And she says, well, you wrote this thing 5 minutes ago that indicates that you don't include me in that category. It reminds me a lot of the conversation between Mehdi Hassan and Paul Collier when he says, what do you define as Indigenous British? And he says, oh, if you're born in Britain. So Mehdi, you would be Indigenous British. And then he reads out the statistics in Paul Collier's book and he's like, okay, but according to these statistics, when you say Indigenous British, you're only referring to white British people. So you would have thought that Goodwin and Collier and all these different people would have been a little bit more prepared for this kind of question. They've been subjected to it before. And it's, the main thing they talk about, which is why they don't like the fact that more British people are, not white-skinned enough for them. Why were they not prepared for this question? Why are they still unable to actually answer it?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. And I think you touch on something really apt there, Dalia, when you talk about this idea that essentially this concept of Britishness, of national identity, is something that can expand and contract and kind of change its boundaries based on what's convenient for people who are making these arguments. One moment you have this idea that, okay, we can all be British. If you're a person of color, you can be a British person, you can be absorbed into this multicultural British identity. But actually then when it's not convenient, this idea of Britishness is often used as euphemism or a kind of dog whistle to actually refer to whiteness, to white Britishness. And then obviously there are other contexts across history in which actually Britishness, again, it contracts even more and becomes something very specific that talks about a specific set of values, this idea of, fundamental British values. And I think that the point you touch on as well about this idea of racialization not just being about the color of your skin. We always hear this phrase, color of your skin, but actually when we talk about race, and especially on the right, this concept of race, like you say, comes with so many ideas that are essentialist, ideas that certain behaviors come with a person's racialization, that there are certain traits, for example, historically, the idea that intelligence is correlated with racialization. And you can probably see where I'm going with this. I think there is a fundamental link here to eugenicist ideology. And that's kind of the historical root, I think, of a lot of ideas that, suggest that your race is tied to your behavior and kind of it's inseparable from this concept of culture, which, like you say, shifts. And I think that, this idea of kind of fear of it's kind of similar to the far right kind of great replacement theory, the idea that there is some white indigenous population that is at risk of being replaced. And as associated with that, that's inherently a negative thing. I think again touches on this idea that there is some essential pure Britishness that is something that needs to be defended. And, as part of that, what does it need to be defended against? The idea is of this racialized other, which is inherently has certain traits, for example, like you say, violence. It really also overlooks the fact that people of colour throughout history have been forcibly brought into the category of Britishness, right? So I often think about the fact that as a person of Caribbean descent, being British was not something that has ever been a choice of mine or was a choice of my family's. It was something that was enforced on us. And we were encouraged to believe that Britain was kind of the mother country, which, my family returned to during the Windrush era. So, yeah, I think that we really have to think about what we're talking about when we talk about Britishness. And when we hear people on the right appealing to this fundamental Britishness, I think we should be really skeptical of that and acknowledge that, like I said, it's always this kind of moving target and this thing that always exists in opposition to this concept of the violent or threatening racialized other.
Why does London and why does Britain look the way it does? People never want to think about the fact that, for so much of the world, we were forced to learn English. And so when people migrate, they migrate to the place where they can speak the language. And so it's amazing that people want this like complete historical break between, a time when we were all kind of like made to abide by a British way of being, and then, our presence in Britain today. And let's then not talk about the processes of neocolonialism that mean that a lot of the countries that we come from have become very difficult to live in because, global debt and, the extraction of resources and all of this, and means that our countries are underdeveloped by our economic system, our global economic system, which Britain is a beneficiary of. So all of that, basically the only way that what Matthew Goodwin says makes sense is when you just wrench out all historical context from the conversation that you're having. Anyway, right, let's wind up there. That was a long show. Thanks, Micha, so much for joining me tonight. It was wonderful to be here in your debut in the co-host seat.
Thank you for having me, Dalia.
And thank you, everyone, for watching this evening. We'll be back from 6 tomorrow. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.